family should be your biggest support system, but what happens when that same family becomes the source of your deepest pain? This is my story of walking away from the people who were supposed to love me the most and how that choice changed my life in ways I could never have imagined. I grew up in a household that could best be described as a battlefield. My parents, who were polar opposites, seemed to only agree on one thing: I was a disappointment. My mother was a perfectionist. Every corner of our home had to be spotless. Every grade had to be an A, and anything less was met with icy silence or harsh words. My father, on the other hand, was emotionally distant, a workaholic who believed showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness. If I wasn't perfect, I wasn't good enough. As the youngest of three, I felt the brunt of their frustration. My two older brothers were both successful by their standards, one an athlete, the other a straight-A student. Then there was me. I wasn't bad at school, but I wasn't a prodigy either. I was artistic, loved drawing and writing stories, but those were seen as hobbies, not real talents. To my parents, if it didn't fit their idea of success, it didn't matter. My parents placed intense pressure on me to follow in my brother's footsteps. My mother pushed me into sports, hoping I'd become the next family athlete. My father demanded academic excellence, constantly reminding me that second place is just first loser. I tried to meet their expectations. I really did. I practiced basketball until my knees hurt, and I studied late into the night, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One particular moment stands out. I had just received my report card, and though it wasn't perfect, it showed real improvement. I proudly handed it to my mother, expecting at least some recognition. Instead, she looked at it, frowned, and said, "You're still not trying hard enough. Why can't you be more like your brothers?" Those words crushed me. It didn't matter how much effort I put in, I would never be enough for her. As I grew older, the pressure only increased. I was constantly reminded of my failures while my brothers were praised for their achievements. What made it worse was that my brothers seemed to relish in the attention. They never stood up for me, never told our parents to ease up, and in some ways they even fueled the comparison by playing the perfect sons. The tension reached a boiling point during my senior year of high school. I had been accepted into a decent university, not the Ivy League school my parents had dreamed of, but it was still a respectable place. I thought they'd be proud, or at least satisfied. But when I told them the news, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. He simply muttered, "You could have done better." That was the moment something inside me snapped. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, bending over backward to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for me. And for what? More disappointment? More rejection? I was done. I decided right then that I wasn't going to keep living my life trying to please people who would never be pleased. I didn't leave immediately, though. It took months of inner turmoil, of going back and forth, trying to decide if I could really walk away from my family. There were moments when I questioned myself. Maybe if I tried a little harder, things would change. But deep down, I knew better. Nothing I did was going to fix this. My family didn't see me for who I was, they only saw who I wasn't. The final push came during a family dinner just a few weeks before I was supposed to leave for college. My parents, as usual, were praising my brothers for their latest achievements, while I sat in silence, ignored. My mother, after what felt like hours of fawning over them, turned to me and said, "Maybe one day you'll make us proud too." I looked around the table, and for the first time I saw things clearly. This was never going to change. They would always see me as the black sheep, the one who couldn't live up to their impossible standards. I made up my mind that night. I wasn't going to go to the university they had chosen for me. Instead, I applied to a smaller, less prestigious school, one that had a strong arts program, far away from home. And then I left. The day I left was explosive. My parents were furious when they found out about my decision. My mother accused me of being selfish, of throwing away my future for a pipe dream. My father didn't say much, but the disappointment in his eyes was enough to break my heart all over again. My brothers didn't intervene. They stood on the sidelines, watching the chaos unfold, just like they always had. I packed my things and moved out without looking back. It was terrifying. I had no idea if I was making the right choice, but I knew I couldn't stay in that toxic environment any longer. The first few months were tough. I was on my own for the first time, with no support from my family, financially or emotionally. But in the midst of that fear, there was also a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. For the first time, I could breathe. College became a time of discovery for me. I threw myself into my art, finally pursuing my passion without the fear of judgment. I made friends who understood and appreciated me for who I was, not for what I could achieve. It was strange at first living a life where I wasn't constantly being compared to others, where I could succeed or fail on my own terms. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when I missed my family, when I wondered if I had made a huge mistake by cutting them off. Holidays were especially hard, seeing friends go home to loving families while I stayed behind, nursing the ache of loneliness. But every time I thought about going back, I remembered how suffocated I had felt under their expectations, and I knew I couldn't return to that life. A few years after I left, my mother reached out. She wanted to meet, to clear the air. I was hesitant, but I agreed. Part of me still longed for their approval, for some kind of closure. When we met, she apologized, sort of. She said she regretted how things had played out, but quickly added that she had only been trying to push me to be my best. It wasn't much of an apology, more of an attempt to justify her actions. I realized then that while my mother might have felt some guilt, she hadn't changed. She still believed that her way was the right way, and that I had simply been too stubborn to see it. My father didn't even come to the meeting. He had always been more emotionally distant, but it still hurt that he hadn't made the effort. That was the last time I tried to reconcile with them. I knew then that I couldn't have the relationship I had always hoped for. They weren't going to change, and I wasn't willing to go back to being the version of myself they wanted. Today, I've built a life that I'm proud of. I'm an artist, and while I'm not famous or wildly successful, I'm happy. I've learned that happiness isn't about meeting other people's expectations, it's about living authentically, pursuing what you love, and surrounding yourself with people who support and uplift you. I still have moments where I grieve the relationship I wish I had with my family. But I've accepted that sometimes walking away is the healthiest thing you can do, even if it's from the people who are supposed to love you the most. It's not easy, and it's not without pain, but it's also the reason I'm where I am today, free, independent, and finally at peace with myself. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that sometimes you have to choose yourself, even when it means walking away from the people who raised you. It's not a decision to take lightly, but if your mental health and happiness are at stake, it's a choice you have every right to make. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've gone through something similar, or if you're struggling with family dynamics, just know that you're not alone. It's okay to set boundaries, to protect yourself, and to pursue the life that makes you happy, even if that means leaving behind the people who are supposed to be closest to you. You deserve peace, and sometimes that peace comes from letting go.